Okay, so we've got quite a few people in attendance now, so we'll kick things off. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for attending today's webinar, which is presented by AWS and Cloudten, and we'll focus on hosting protected data in AWS. Now, during the course of today, after I give a brief introduction, we'll give an overview of the IRAP process and recent changes which have come about through updates to the CCSL. Then we'll step through the motions of how we have created templated protected data centers in the cloud and how we maintain continuous compliance. At the end, we'll have some questions. Now, because this is a webinar, it'll be great if we can wait till the end of the presentation. You'll notice that there's a Q&A button down the bottom of the webinar screen. Please feel free during the course of the webinar to put any questions that you may have. And towards the end, the panelists will go through and answer those questions one by one. What we might do initially is just to check that everyone can see and hear. We're just going to pop up a quick little survey just to see how everyone's reception is going. If you could just click on that, and then we can continue. All right. Okay, all right, that's looking pretty good. Okay, so once again, thank you for attending. My name is Richard Tompkinson. I'm the Managing Director of Cloudten. We're an advanced AWS consulting partner that specialises in security and data services. And since the government passed their Cloud First mandate a few years ago, we've been working quite closely with government and other commercial vendors to help migrate and deploy workloads into the cloud. So that has culminated in earlier this year with the very first IRAP certified protective workload for a federal government department. Now, joining me today is Sarah Gray. She's an enterprise solutions architect from AWS. She's based down in Canberra, specialises in security and compliance. She'll be talking about the AWS journey to protected and recent updates that have been announced by the ACSC and how they affect the IRAP process. Julian Hickey, Senior Cloud Architect from Cloudten, will then walk us through the high-level steps involved in establishing a cloud data center, capable of passing an IRAP audit and how to maintain continuous compliance in there. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Sarah. I will stop my share and pass to her. Hold on.
Thank you for the introduction, Richard. Today, as part of the presentation, I'm going to spend a few minutes going over what is the IRAP program with regards to the certification of cloud services, what is protected, and go through some of the changes that are coming within the next month, so by the end of June, with regards to the certification of cloud services within Australia. As part of my presentation and the rest of the webinar today, there will be a lot of acronyms that will be spoken about throughout the presentation. So before we go too much further, I thought it would be best to cover some of the key acronyms off. So the first is the Australian Cybersecurity Centre. This is an Australian government body which is part of the Australian Signals Directorate, or the ASD. The ACSC is the owner of the Australian Government Information Security Manual, or the ISM, and this is the government guidelines for control requirements for the protection of Australian government data. Next is the Information Security Registered Assessors Program, or IRAP. This is a program made up of registered assessors who independently assess systems against the ISM to their effectiveness of meeting control requirements as per the ISM. Next is the Cloud Services Certification Program. This program, owned by the ASD, included the certification of cloud services by the ACSC, of which, upon completion, if successful, would see services listed on the Certified Cloud Services list. So what does it mean to be protected? Protected under the definition of the Protective Security Policy Framework is a data classification that is given to data which is of national interest or high business impact to the Australian government. It is usually data that, if compromised, could impact the delivery of government policy. So it's very sensitive in nature. In January 2019, AWS received certification to process and store data up to and including protected data by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, or the ACSC. Receiving protected certification has enabled Australian government entities and those private entities that engage with those to build with confidence that AWS can meet Australian government requirements to process data of this sensitivity. The depth and breadth of our certified services has enabled developers to reimagine both how government entities engage with citizens, as well as how data is collected, stored, and processed to develop better outcomes to Australians. Ultimately, citizens have benefited with improved government services and flow-on benefits of AWS, such as cost savings, which can be reallocated to government programs. So the AWS journey to protected. As mentioned previously, in January 2019, AWS sought to have 42 services certified by the Australian Cybersecurity Centre and was awarded that certification for those services to process protected data. The process that we undertook the certification is no different than any other system that undergoes a certification for processing Australian government data. We started off our process by going through an IRAP review, and this was done in two phases. The first one was a documentation review, which included information about our services, control design, and our processes, and this was reviewed in a stage 1 IRAP assessment. Then, as part of the second stage, our IRAP assessor met with our service teams and saw the systems and controls in operation to validate the existence of the controls that were documented and the effectiveness. Once those two artefacts were developed, we then passed them on to the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, who at the time was the certification authority for cloud services. They deep dived through the documentation, validated everything with us and our IRAP assessor, and once they were confident that we met the requirements for processing protected data, they gave us the certification for those 42 services and then listed AWS on the certified cloud services list. Following on from there, we've had numerous feedback from our customers around the benefit that they see having 42 services certified to process protected data on AWS. And listening to our customers, we have then sought to have further services certified. In January 2020 this year, we undertook the IRAP assessment process again and had a further 22 services included into the scope to process protected data as part of our IRAP assessment. The new category areas now include artificial intelligence, machine learning, and IoT services, which has been really fundamental for things like smart cities initiatives across Australia. So what you can see on your screen now is the services that were in scope as part of the 2019 certification. And since then, here's the additional services that have been implemented to our IRAP assessed services. So if you access our AWS artifact, you would see the IRAP assessment for all 64 services listed on the screen here. So it was mentioned earlier by Richard that some changes happening to the CSCP. And as of late January 2019, the Australian Signals Directorate actually commissioned an independent review of its Cloud Services Certification Program, or the CSCP, and the Information Security Registered Assessors Program, or IRAP. As part of that review, a number of recommendations were made and included things like closing the CSCP and create a new co-design cloud security guidelines with industry, grow and enhance IRAP, establish government and industry consultative forums for cybersecurity, and update incentives in procurement and administrative instructions and guidance to reflect the cessation of the CSCP. So what does this mean? This means that as a result, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, or the ACSC, will no longer be the certification authority for cloud services. What that will mean is that now Commonwealth entities will have the privilege of being able to make their own assessments around the certification of cloud services. As a result, government entities will then seek to do a self-assessment of cloud services, which could then open up more opportunities to explore services that meet their individual needs. So I mentioned self-assessment. How does a government department do this? Well, they can access the protected package that's available on AWS Artifact and receive our IRAP assessment reports and go through them and our reference architectures and make an assessment as to whether or not the services meet their needs for the processing of their protected data. They can review and assess the system documentation that we make available on Artifact against their requirements and make an individual assessment as to whether it meets their security needs and the needs of their business. After reviewing these documents and assessing these needs and the security risk, they will then seek to have one of their certification authority within their departments actually certified to process protected data. So here, there'll still be an IRAP assessment that the government agencies will be able to leverage, but they'll be able to make their own risk assessment around how they leverage our protected services and then certify. Obviously, with this, it can be quite a daunting process, and partners like Cloudten have been highly effective in helping our customers navigate this process. I'll now pass on to Jamie, who will talk about Cloudten's journey working with our customers around helping with certification.
Not actually on mute. Can you hear me? Yeah. Hey everyone, my name's Julian. I'm a solutions architect for Cloudten. Thanks very much, Sarah, for taking us through the AWS perspective on IRAP. So what we're going to do now is take you through our hands-on experience with doing IRAP assessments for the public sector and the private sector, but mainly for public sector. I'm going to take you through a couple of different patterns that we use and show you some examples of what IRAP assessors are looking for, etc. So here we go. So one thing that we see sort of universally is that most organizations have already invested a lot into their data center already. So they've got a pretty big IT footprint. They've got their own compliance tools, their own tooling. All of their teams are set up to support what's running in the data center. And to try and launch a protected workload on another platform into the cloud, for example, there's a lot of challenges there. You need to maintain that compliance as you move. But when we talk to people about this, what we really sort of say is that there's two schools of thought. And the first one is a pretty common pattern where you're running a hybrid data center. And your approach there is to extend your data center into the cloud and use all the same tooling, etc., that you've already got set up to manage the cloud. And then the other school of thought, which is the one that we usually try and promote, is that you can create an entire data center on AWS that's its own ecosystem. And it can use some of the tools that you've already got, and it can use some of the newer tools or cloud native tools that might actually do the job a little bit better. So I'll try and sort of cover both of these, but one thing that we really like to promote is that you can run a dedicated data center for protected workloads. Right, so when you do an IRAP assessment, whether that's your own internal assessment or you get an external assessor to come in and do an assessment, the three things that anyone is looking for is policy, process, and evidence or compliance. So what does that mean? So policy is when you're first contemplating launching into the cloud, you need to establish some policies and you need to review the ISM. So the ISM has something like 800 controls. And when you start designing your data center, you need to go through them fairly carefully. But not all of them are going to apply. For example, there's a lot of stuff in the ISM about physical locations. So you can cross a whole bunch of those out if you're going to be using a cloud data center. And really, it's up to you to determine which of the policies apply to you. For example, if you're not going to be using databases, then there's a whole huge section on databases that you can cross off your list to start with. So you need to go through the ISM to set your policies. But you also need to decide how you're going to run your AWS architecture. So there's some pretty obvious stuff here. It's part of the ISM, but it's also pretty obvious is you need to do region lockdown. So you only want to run your workloads within Australia. And you want to have encrypted volumes and you want to lock down your S3 buckets and stuff. So between the ISM and your own common sense, you need to establish policy. And the second thing you need to do is decide on an architecture that's actually going to allow you to meet those policies. So that's where you start designing and deciding on what tools you're going to use, cloud native services, etc., and setting up an architecture that supports your policy and writing the processes that are actually going to be used to enforce them. And then the last one, which is where people typically struggle quite badly in a physical data center, is running compliance tools across your entire landscape. And this is what the IRAP assessors really are looking for, is at the end of the day that you've got a policy, most people do, and you've got a process, but are you actually following it? Can you demonstrate that your backup policy, the way you're doing a backup, that you've actually done backups and restores before? So that's what the evidence is all about. And I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. So look, I'll just give you one example before we move on about policy, process, and evidence. So here's a rule from the ISM, which is quite wordy, but I'll read through it and I'll explain what it is. So it says, encrypted software used for data at rest implements full disk encryption or partial encryption where access controls will only allow writing to the encrypted partition. So it's kind of complicated, but what is really now you've got your policy that you decided that you need to work towards, and then you have a process that you need to follow to do that. So with AWS, it's actually really easy to do this, is that you can set a policy using KMS that says, I want to encrypt all of my volumes using AES 256. And how do you enforce that? Well, again, AWS organizations allows you to create policies at the root level of your organization to enforce that. And then the last one is the evidence. Oh, my screen share's dropped out. Let me share again. That better? Yep, okay, cool. Sorry about that. So yeah, the last pillar is evidence and compliance. So you want to demonstrate that all of your volumes are encrypted. There's two ways to go. You can use something like AWS config rules, which will report on anything that's not encrypted and show it as a breach. Or you can use a third-party tool like Palo Alto's Prisma, which is a really good compliance tool and will do similar policy enforcement. Cool, so I'm just going to talk about a protected landscape. Now, a lot of these concepts here are going to be familiar to everyone. These are things that you do need to include when you're doing pretty much any architecture, but this is the approach that we use when we talk to our clients about protected. So the first pillar, or the first thing we focus on, is secure foundations. And this is pretty obvious in terms of networking. You need a private link, you need a dedicated link, and you need it to be encrypted. So that's something that's a key part of any design. The second one is templated deployment. Obviously, everything these days is written in code, infrastructure is code, it's pretty common, but this is really a gospel here, is that everything needs to be done in code, including your firewalls, etc. And I'll take you through what that sort of means to us. The third one is where an integration partner like Cloudten can really help you out. You want your accounts, etc., that you launch on AWS in your data center to be out-of-the-box compliant. And you want them to immediately connect to your identity systems. You want a really good backend logging system like a Sumo Logic or a Splunk. And you need all your ITSM tooling set up from the get-go so that you can consume these services immediately. And you want that integrated from the beginning. And then the fourth one is continuous compliance. And look, there's a lot of compliance tools out there, but the key here is, as long as your compliance tool is at least doing automated inventory, then you've got a really good view on what you're running. Cool, so look, I'm just going to dive into each one of these just a little bit to give you an idea of what's expected. And these are really sort of linear in terms of what we actually do when we're building a protected data center. So the first thing that you need to do is set up your connectivity and straight up get a direct connect from your data center into AWS. And the second thing that you need to do is create a transit gateway. A transit gateway is a layer 3 router, and it acts as a hub for all of your connected AWS services and all of your different accounts. And the other great thing about Transit Gateway is that it's got a VPN service that you can easily create VPNs on top of the Transit Gateway and connect them back into your data center. So with the combination of the Direct Connect, Transit Gateway, and Transit Gateway VPN, you've got a fully encrypted tunnel through to AWS. The second is templated deployment. So now that you've established that you've got your connectivity, you really want to bring together all of those policies and processes and things that you've decided to do into something that you can deploy. Now, traditionally, you can actually build all of this stuff by hand, but AWS has a really good tool called Landing Zone, which I think most people have heard of. Landing Zone will do the initial setup of your organization. So it will build you a root level organization and set up a pipeline underneath it that creates your different accounts. And at the end of the day, it's got a vending machine that allows you to create additional accounts with a wizard-driven functionality. And what happens is when you create these accounts, they inherit all of the controls and security that you decided at the root level of your account. And as a best practice for running lots and lots of workloads on AWS, the best practice approach is to actually create pretty much a single account per workload. The reason for that is that it's much, much easier to understand billing when that workload is in its own account. Because when data transits in and out of an account, it's difficult to allocate it to someone, to one cost center or another if you've got different workloads running there. So there's a lot of other limitations, but that's basically best practice. So you design your landing zone to incorporate all of the security controls that you wanted, especially a security policy at the root level that locks down all of the AWS services that you're going to use. You can't really say you've got a protected data center unless you're only using those services which you have assessed either by AWS assessment or your own assessment to be included in the data center. So the third step, as I said before, is integrating with your other services. And the way to think about integrating with your other services is that you want to have when you vend out a new account for someone for their workload, you want it to be operationally ready. And there's a couple of things that you need to make it operationally ready. So before you launch your landing zone, you want to customize these three things. The first one is you want to customize it so that when you vend out an account, it connects directly to your transit gateway. so that your networking layer is already complete. The second one that you want to do is integrate with your identity system. So within your pipeline for vending out accounts, you can customize Landing Zone to actually connect to your Active Directory, or what we've done in the past is connect to ADFS and Okta. So once you vend out the account, it's connected to your network, and your users who already have AD accounts, admin accounts, they can start consuming the account immediately. And the third one is establishing a gateway. So at some stage, your services, your workloads are going to want to communicate with the internet. And a gateway usually, traditionally, is placed at the edge, and everyone calls them an edge. But what we recommend for protected workloads is actually to bring the edge back into the center of the data center. What I mean by that is not only monitor your traffic that's coming in and out of the network, but actually monitor traffic that's traveling within the network as well. So both north-south and east-west traffic can go to the firewall. There's another really good reason for doing this, other than sort of raising the level of your security within the network to truly protect your data, because that's what protected is all about, it's the data, is that now that you've got the TGW as a hub, you will be connecting all of your different accounts to it. And it's fantastic that they can all route together and talk together on the hub, and even connect other VPNs to third parties, etc. That's fantastic. But you don't necessarily want to be managing the routing at the TGW. You don't, every time you create an account, want to go to your TGW and have to go and do a whole bunch of routing and stuff. And you don't want to have to manage at your edge, at your VPCs, your NACLs, and your security groups, etc. So what we recommend, and this is a design that we worked with F5 and a couple of our other tier 1 vendors on, is having your first hop at the TGW go to the firewall. So by doing this, all traffic on the network actually has a first hop of the firewall. The firewall allows you to control where your traffic is going. It lets you do all of your IPS, IDS, and WAF, and all of those things that you really need to do to meet the ISM across your entire network, and have a central place for controlling it. And the last one is continuous compliance. And look, as I was saying, the most important thing about continuous compliance is understanding what you guys have. So you've obviously got your policies and your processes and your compliance. You can run AWS native tools. There's quite a few good tools, but third-party tools actually have quite a few other advantages. And one of them that we really like is Prisma. Most of the tools will do a similar job in that you're going to have a set of rules, and it's going to report against your rules. It's going to show you if your S3 buckets are open. It's going to show you if your volumes are encrypted. It's going to show you if someone launches something outside of your AU region. But it's no good if, like, 3 months later you run the tool and you find out something that is outside of your AU region. I mean, that's no good. So what Prisma does is it actually has a lockdown feature, and it can enforce compliance. So if it notices that someone's launched something outside of the region, it can go and shut it down for you. So when you're running protected workloads, this is something that just gives you that added confidence that everything is in order. And the other thing you've got to remember is that potentially a year from now, you might want to make changes to your infrastructure, and you might want to re-IRAP assess yourself or get a third party to come in. So these types of tools are just going to give you that immediate reporting that you need to demonstrate when someone wants to do an audit. Cool, so that's basically our approach for building protected data centers for organizations. And I'm just going to take you through some of the things that we've sort of learned over time, and some of the reasons why you would want to get an integrator like Cloudten to help you out. So one of the things that we sort of universally see is that there's a skills shortage on AWS. Often you'll have a cloud team, but having the knowledge and depth that's required to launch a landing zone, most teams don't really have that. The other thing is that IRAP assessments take a lot of teamwork. So the IRAP assessors, when they get to that process and evidence part, they want to go and talk to your teams and sort of understand what the processes are and have them demonstrate how they do them. So, for example, they're going to check your trouble tickets. So they're going to want to see trouble tickets of backup and restore processes that your teams have run. Yeah, so that's my point here, is that you got to demonstrate that you're actually doing the things you say, and you need to be ready to repeat your IRAP later. And just some of the technical challenges that we faced. So DNS logging is a pretty strict rule, and in your VPC, ideally you'd want to be using the AWS .2 DNS resolver because it's really fast, etc. But you need to actually log all of your DNS requests. So one of the things and challenges that we had were pumping your DNS request through a central service and then logging it as well. The other ones to watch out for is how you're going to do your policies. So are you going to whitelist the services that you want, or are you going to blacklist the ones that you don't want? And this is a bit of a challenge in itself. There's other limitations to watch out for. VPNs are only 1.25 gigabits. Monitoring the performance of that network is tricky. Challenge that comes along with the first workload with your anchor tenant is how you're going to get the data across to the protected zone in a protected fashion. How do you do that? And that's some of the challenges that we've had. And then look, some of the other really great stuff that I haven't sort of mentioned about building a protected data center all on its own with its own ecosystem and building it from scratch using patterns that you've already tested or we can help you with, is that a lot of time is often spent doing documentation at the end of a project. So you'll have your build and design and build, and then you'll go into documentation. But with compliance tools and automated inventories, these inventories can actually create an as-built for you. But you need to know that that's what you're going to be doing right from the beginning. But this is a really huge bonus in terms of deploying from right from the start. Also, firewalls and load balancers. When we design and build our gateways, we actually build all of the configuration and orchestrate the firewalls, etc., using CloudFormation. But the configuration of any VPN tunnels or any connectivity to each other is all done in Ansible. And not all organizations are ready to run their firewalls in Ansible, but it is something to aim towards. And the reason that you would want to do that is when you're developing applications, you would build those in code, but then you often get to the network guys and say, I need you to open the firewall rules for me. And this is sort of quite a challenge for the dev team and the network team to actually work together. But if you can actually program your firewalls and your load balancers in code, that can become part of your pipeline. And it just makes that risk assessment, when you go to CAB and say, I want to launch this workload, they can see that it's written in code and that there'll be no mistakes. So that's a real bonus if your organization is sort of ready for that CI/CD thing. The other one is that with the introduction of the TGW, it uses BGP. Now, BGP is a dynamic routing protocol, and the advantage here is that all of the devices in your gateway can share routing information. So previously, having active firewalls was quite difficult. Failing over firewalls used automation, but now with TGW and BGP, the routing layer actually takes care of itself because they're all participating in the same routing layer. It's a huge advantage for high availability. And yeah, so you can scale out your devices much more easily. You can add additional devices because they're participating in that routing layer. And the other thing, this is a hard one to explain, but rather than having your IPs based on 2 different devices and having 2 different ranges, BGP lets you have the same IP range running on all of the devices at once. This is called anycast routing. This is basically how the internet runs, and it means that failover, etc., is really just taken care of. There's a lot less thinking to do in terms of failover, etc. And also with landing zone and with any data center that we design and deploy, we're putting in a solution for automated backups. We put in a scheduled automated start and stop process for you guys. And the other one that's really hard to understand is costs. Your workloads are really easy to understand how much they cost because they all run in their own account. And last but not least, I think I already touched on this before, but not having that middleman to set up your networking is amazing. Having an automated deployment system, your IT teams don't need to know how it all works. They just need to know that they need to launch a workload, they have a process, they go to vending machine and they create the account. So that's a really big advantage. You don't have to have a huge cloud network team. You don't need to engage your network team every time you want to launch something, and really just speeds up the whole process. So that is the end of the webinar from myself. And I think we're going to do a quick poll, and then we're going to take a few questions. So you guys can fill out the poll in your own time, and I'm just going to load the Q&A and go through a couple of questions. Okay. So I've got a question here. How long would a self-assessment typically take, and what are the next steps I should take? So a self-assessment, it depends on how committed your teams are to the process. If you're doing a self-assessment, you need to be dedicated to it, and you need to do at least a weekly meeting, one with every service team. So in our experience, I think about 4 to 8 weeks is about the right timing for a self-assessment, or even external assessment takes about that long. And then often there's little parts that you need to remediate. You've decided, okay, you've done an assessment, but you want to remediate a few little things, and you know, you should give yourself a bit of time as well at the end to do that. Another one is around timing and scheduling. It says, how long would it take to deploy a compliant data center like this in the cloud? So I've actually deployed this exact scenario that I've described to you guys with transit gateways, full-blown internal gateway in 3 months. And that's from design and build to implementation. However, the IRAP assessment did actually take a little bit longer. So you probably want to start your assessment about halfway through, and because you can't really assess something if you don't have it built. But yeah, 3 months to actually do design and build. And depending on what your specifications are, we already have all of these designs and patterns, which are pretty much press button. So the technical side of things isn't that difficult for us. I'm not sure if I know the answer to this one, but let me have a go. So
maybe Sarah knows that. Were AWS given much of an idea as to why the CCSL is being retired?
Yeah, go for it. I'll go on mute.
The guidance that we have been given is the same that has been given to the public and all of the vendors. And there is actually a, if you navigate to the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, there is actually a press release that fully documents the reasons as part of it. The thing that I see is that, you know, as a vendor, it takes a long time for those assessments of cloud services to go through, and that it's growing. Cloud services is growing, the number of vendors that are providing software as a service solutions. And I think that the sentiment behind it was to allow agencies to have more control over, you know, their risk assessments and what services are leveraged as part of the certification process. So it's handing a lot more of the power around assessing these services back to the agencies, which ultimately bear the risk as of a certification. So, but yeah, I would definitely navigate to the public content that's published on the Australian Cybersecurity Centre for more information around the context of the review and the decision-making process. But we were given the same information that everyone was given publicly.
Thanks, Sarah. So another question which I answered in line was, you've mentioned a few firewalls. Is there a list of Australian government approved firewalls? So in the response there, There's the evaluated products list from the ACSC. I've put that list in there. Now, it's also important to note that that kind of inherits from the common criteria list, which is a larger list. So both those product lists I've put in the chat window there. Let's see what else we've got here. There's a question here around Prisma. Does Prisma integrate with ISM controls so that it can provide the list of missing controls? Now, I do think we have, do we have Dominic from Palo on? No. We've got Stan. Could you just unmute Stan Soteropoulos, Kate?
Good morning, Richard.
Hey.
Can you repeat that question quickly, sorry?
So it was, does Prisma integrate with ISM controls to provide a list of missing controls? Like, is it, I think it's asking if the ISM rule set is kind of embedded within Prisma itself.
Yeah, so we've got about 13, I guess, frameworks and standard policies that we actually support out of the box. In regards to ISM specifically, there's a lot of ones that overlap with, NIST and a lot of the different sort of standards that we support, but also the product itself can be customized quite easily to create custom policies to suit local regional requirements as well.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question is, how do you demonstrate evidence if the solution hasn't been IRAP assessed to use for production workloads? Do you want to have a stab at that one, Sarah?
Sure. So the Information Security Manual documents the control requirements expected for various classifications of data. And what we do and what we recommend customers do is use our services, use the functionality, and use the configurations available to meet those control objectives. Then what you do is then get an IRAP assessor to come in and validate the design. As Julian mentioned earlier, getting an IRAP assessor in earlier to see whether or not you will actually meet the requirements and possibly pivot if necessary is really, really critical. Then once you've started working with the IRAP assessor and you've got a good understanding around whether your design will meet those requirements, then go through to the build and complete the IRAP assessment. A number of production workloads go through, it's actually an ISM requirement that before a workload goes to production, it needs to be IRAP assessed. So everyone has gone through this process before it's become a production workload. It's around being able to demonstrate that you've got appropriate mitigations in place to meet the intent of the Information Security Manual and satisfy to the IRAP assessor that you meet the control requirements expected for a certain classification of data.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, so the very last question we've got, unless there are any more, is what is the WOGA, the WOGA I keep hearing about? So I can answer that one. So the whole of government agreement was an agreement signed off between the Australian Federal Government, the DTA, and AWS at the very start of last year. Basically, it allows all of government to consume AWS services without having an independent master services agreement between each entity. It also provides significant bulk usage discounts and the ability to prepay for services. So it's basically an agreement between AWS and government. So I think that has answered all of the questions. Now, is there any more questions? I think there's a raise hand feature as well on the webinar tool. If anybody would like to either post or ask any questions. Okay. All right. Once again, thank you everybody for your attendance today. We had a really good attendance. We will be providing a link to the recording of this, so you can pass it on to anyone who missed it. Thanks again, everybody. Enjoy your day, and bye.